In 2012, the anime adaptation of Sword Art Online swept the nation. The nation being weebs with a gaming addiction, aka Reddit Island. If you're somehow not familiar, the premise is pretty simple. If you die in the game, you die in real life. You also can't leave the game before you make it through. CrossCode doesn't have the exact same premise, but the MMO game within another piece of media as a full dive virtual reality is what we're looking for. Hi. But you can just simply call me Amazon, and today we talk about CrossCode, an indie game that manages to transcend the $1 million franchise that is Sword Art Online in a landslide victory. It was released in 2018, made by German indie studio Radical Fish Games. CrossCode was crowdfunded and had a 3-year stint in early access. It's on most modern consoles and PC, where I played the game. It's a around $20 game, 6 or 7 on a sale. The game's DLC expansion, A New Home, was released years later in 2021. Before making this video, I played CrossCode twice. There's no real build variety here, to the point where different playstyles can't be merged together in a single playthrough, so that's why I didn't play it more. I also played the DLC, A New Home. I will not be speaking about that in this video, it's a separate thing, but also not really. I will summarize the entire game's main story and analyze and reflect on it as we go. I'm front-loading the start of the video a bit more with discussion about the gameplay loop, so we can all understand and talk about the other stuff as we get to them. I'll end it all out with a conclusion. Feel free to skip to that part if you only want the footnotes and the main critique. With that said, this video will spoil the entire story of the game. If you at any point feel the game could be for you, go out and play it. It deserves more players. This video will be here after your 40 or so hour playthrough, so you know what to feel about it afterwards. I'm only kind of kidding. CrossCode opens with a dream sequence. It doesn't mean much to us right now, but we'll instantly recognize a couple of things. The character we're playing as looks very similar to our protagonist, the girl on the box art. This gets our gears turning. Is this a long-lost sister, a twin, a clone, or a real-life equivalent? We don't get any answers here. But this is a very central plot point we'll get back to in a while. We learn the very basics. Moving with the left stick, attacking, dodging with the dash, and charging our special moves. It's a minimalist tutorial that doesn't linger. Some guy calls us Shizuka, tells us he finished something, letting us go. Then he falls to the floor. He urges us to, quote, get away, and presumably dies. Title drop. We are initialized again, this time as the blue-haired chick, our amnesiac main character Leah. That's what I will be calling her, by the way. Some people call her Lee. That doesn't make sense to me. I'm calling her Leah. We can't speak, a forced silenced protagonist. We've been seemingly awakened by Sergey, a green-haired looking dude who appears throughout the game to talk to us directly. We're introduced to the second big part of CrossCode's combat, the second stick on our controller, the second stick in the twin-stick shooter. We're led through a series of puzzles that introduce us to some of the introductory parts of that side of the game. Puzzles are something the game does very well, but I'll speak on them more when I get to the more puzzle-heavy parts of the game. The setup for the world we've been placed into is pretty simple. Welcome! This is CrossWorlds, a massively multiplayer online game with one stark difference. The world we play in isn't virtual, it's real. Certain elements of it are totally fake. Players are placed into avatars, a physical form made out of a fake element called instant matter, which can be altered by the game's code. To see the more gamey parts of the game, like enemies, the bolts we shoot and so on, you have to be an avatar or put on special AR glasses. There are a couple of classes in the game, I'll speak on them a bit as we see them firsthand, but Leah, our protagonist, is a Spheromancer, a pretty general class with lots of options. It's also not a very popular class. Leah is special outside of this though. We're not a regular player. We've been here before, and we're back to hopefully recover our memories of the past. Sergey hardcodes a word into our character. Hi. The premise of this world is pretty outlandish, but it manages to feel more than realistic in the game's own world. Parts of it could have been simplified and reworked, The fact we're on a whole different planet or the existence of instant matter does make explaining the interaction between some things easier, but their existence to begin with is a bit out there. But to reiterate, almost all of this feels very believable in the game itself, so I'm just nitpicking at this point. We meet up with the captain of the ship we're on and learn about braking, basically staggering opponents, shields and so on. Again, I'll speak on the combat later on, just like the puzzles. We're interrupted by a peculiar looking flying guy, seemingly another avatar. He's out to get us for some reason. Our first boss fight. It's fine. A great introduction how bosses will work from now on. Multiple health bars that signal different phases of the battle, adding new attacks or completely new mechanics. This one is very simple, but it's obviously on purpose. We're saved by the captain. We run away and are immediately thrusted into the playground, Newcomer's Bridge, the intro to the CrossWorlds MMO's world. If I had to come up with something bad about this intro, it would be how heavy it is. It teaches us a lot of very useful gameplay mechanics and good to know things about its plot, but you're almost assaulted with information, world building and mechanics for an hour straight. For me, on a second playthrough, after a while of not playing the game, it was a nice reintroduction to the game I already knew and loved, but for someone completely new this would feel like a lot. The first dream sequence is almost certainly forgotten by this point, and some of the characters we meet on the boat aren't seen again for basically half of the game. It's all a bit too much. On Newcomer's Bridge, we meet two central characters. A seemingly French, talkative, red-headed pentafist who loves a good race called Emilianator, shortened to Emily. We also meet Apollo, another spheromancer with a grass-like head of hair. He's extremely proud and dramatic. He also suspects us of cheating because we're a bit too high of a level. We did fight a boss on the boat and all that. We're finally done with the tutorial in the game within the game and meet another character, Schneider, or Lucas, a German-sounding tribe leader that shows us around Rookie Harbor, the pallet town of CrossWorlds, where all new players begin, get their quest and shop for items. As if we've not gotten enough to think about, we're introduced to the main story of CrossWorlds, the game within the game we're playing. I'll try to summarize it for you. We're on the path of Ancients, a part of Operation Trackwalker, to find old hidden technology left behind by a long-forgotten race. We must first gather the 4 elements, starting with heat in the village of Bergen. We're given our first key, a so-called shade, so that we may begin our journey. It's a very simple story, but that's probably for the best considering all the intermingling stories being told here. So we're officially free to start playing the game. CrossCode has a very long intro, a little over an hour, but compared to lots of other JRPGs, that's actually not that bad. Now that we have the freedom, let's talk about CrossCode's gameplay loop. But just before we dive deeper into the gameplay, CrossCode looks and sounds amazing. I just want it out there. I'll speak on some of the locations as we get there, but yeah, CrossCode looks very consistently amazing, and sometimes it goes well above that. The one thing that made me play CrossCode in the first place was the combat. I had pretty recently finished Fury, a boss rush twin-stick bullet hell with melee mechanics, and I was looking for something to play. I have many a time tried to play JRPGs, lots of times successfully, Persona 3, 5 and the Fire Emblem game on the Switch, but what always made me bounce off was the turn-based combat. I looked for JRPGs with real-time action and here we are. I did stumble upon lots of other games before this one, but they all felt less interesting, or they were inferior versions of turn-based games. I also did see CrossCode in the background of at least one Linus Tech Tips video, so that might be the actual reason. CrossCode's combat, unlike those games, does not feel like an oversight in the slightest. The foundation of CrossCode's combat is the duality between melee and ranged. The melee combat feels extremely responsive and is the best way to do damage. There's a trade-off here though. You have to be up close and personal, so if you haven't mastered the dodge or shield mechanics, or maybe even the parry, you'll dominate. Your basic attacks are pretty fast and all lead into a finisher, allowing you to combo. By dashing in and out of your attacks, you also reset your combo, extending it before the finisher. This is a very central mechanic that the game doesn't go out of its way to tell you. It does tell you how it works, but in the form of a missable side quest. On the other hand, there's the ranged combat, which uses the right stick to aim and fire balls, a mechanic that turns the game into a twin-stick shooter when needed. These balls can either be charged, noted by the cone of accuracy closing in, or by the sound it makes, or we just spam and deal lots of damage. This charge shot is fundamental in puzzles, but also acts as one of the ways to apply statuses with our elemental modes. I'll get more into those later on when we obtain them, but yeah. This duality between ranged and melee is where CrossCode truly shines. We're constantly switching between up-close unga bunga and precise ranged attacks to deal with a variety of enemies and situations. It's relatively deep if you want it to be, especially when we get those elements I've name dropped a couple of times, but even before that, there is plenty of tech here to dive into. Enemy design in CrossCode is another triumph. The game has a very diverse array of foes that require unique strategies to defeat. In the first area, Autumn's Rise, we meet simple hedgehogs called hedgehags with a classic run-at-you ability. There's the hillcat, a ranged enemy, and the bovine, a big bull buffalo-looking thing. Each enemy has pretty distinct attack patterns, resistances, and behaviors. I have to admit that a lot of them can just be kind of spanned through. It's not about animation and timing as much as something like Dark Souls. Numbers mean a lot here. Thankfully, combat isn't just about dealing damage, it's also about learning how to exploit each enemy's weaknesses, especially earlier on and when you're leveled correctly. This is where the game's breaking mechanic comes into play. By hitting enemies with the right type of attack at the right time, you can stagger them, opening them up to critical damage. This system is intuitive yet layered, rewarding players who pay close attention to enemies' patterns and positioning. Boss battles are where all of these parts come together to make something truly great. Multi-phase enemies that demand near mastery of every mechanic introduced up to that point. Almost all of them come down to breaking, then doing enough damage to make it to the next phase. But some are different. PvP battles are all about damage numbers and avoiding taking damage yourself. Each phase of these boss battles introduce new attacks or patterns, requiring players to adapt on the fly. They're essentially puzzles, often straight from the dungeon they're encountered in, and honestly, they vary in quality, but again, we'll get to some of those in a while. The controls deserve praise as well. I played both using a controller and keyboard and mouse, but the controller won out for me this time around. The aiming using a mouse feels somewhat more responsive, it's a better aiming tool. But because of the top-down perspective and the twin-stick nature of the game, using a joystick felt great here. The only real downside here is the fact that the block isn't easier to do, having to move your finger from the left stick when you're aiming if you want to do a quick shield or parry. Could I have remapped it? Probably. Did I? No. To summarize, CrossCode's combat system is an outright masterclass in combat game design. It balances fluidity with depth, it has amazing puzzle combat in boss fights, but also manages to have a more relaxed, yet engaging combat system against mob enemies that together make something special, all the while looking super cool. CrossCode's movement is very simple. Move in different directions using your left stick. In combat, this is expanded a bit with the dodge and some combat arts, that's the special moves that move you around. But outside of that, there's very little depth here when moving around. It's not completely mindless though, because in this game, unlike most other top-down retro-style RPGs, we can jump. It's not bound to a button, which again means that there's very little freedom here in terms of movement. But that's only partially true, because one thing CrossCode does that I've basically never seen in any top-down game like this is its emphasis on the other axis, the Y-axis in Minecraft, up and down. Not north, but levels on top of other levels. This is in itself definitely not a new concept, but the way it interacts with the movement almost certainly is. This brings us to the level design, something CrossCode does exemplarily well. The level's design, verticality and spatial depth makes exploration more than just looking in every corner of a room. There also is very little loot to be found that way, maybe a plant or two to hit for a crafting recipe. Where it really shines is when we get to a higher altitude, when we get to run on the walls that just a second ago acted as a barrier. Unlike traditional flat layouts, the environments in CrossCodes are extremely multi-layered, with platforms, ledges, and hidden pathways carefully placed to encourage thoughtful traversal and well thought out exploration. It does all of this without making it look overly weird or artificial, and without making the main path hard to follow. It's a very fine line to tread, and they did so very gracefully. The exploration is more of a puzzle than anything, making these relatively small rooms compared to other games with great exploration just as much fun to explore. Secrets can be found almost everywhere. It's not all great here though. The biggest issue is how hard it can be to tell which level some of the platforms are on. Our depth perception gets thrown out of the window sometimes, especially on levels where the graphics make it harder, or where these platforms are more freestanding over a seemingly endless pit. There are some ways to make it less of a problem. Aiming shows you pretty well. Your aiming reticle and line has a shadow and can bounce off walls higher up. It's not the biggest issue. I can't think of a single time where this impacted me more than, oh, I need to run all the way back there. You don't instantly die from stuff like this either way, so again, it's more of an inconvenience than anything. Where all of this goes from good to spectacular is when we start doing puzzle, another cornerstone of its design, seamlessly integrated into exploration and combat. People often like to compare the puzzles here to those from top-down Zelda games, but I can't really echo that because I've never finished any of them. Early puzzles are simple. Bounce a ball off a wall in a certain way, almost always in one of the 8 cardinal directions. There are some outliers here and some sneaky ways you can game some of the puzzles, but most of them play out like this for now. They often combine this with moving, racing pathways and opening parkour segments. Sometimes they're timed, sometimes they require and then OR gates and other stuff. The vast majority of puzzles are found in dungeons, and they often add their own new mechanic or gimmick we then see in future ones. Later on, tens upon tens of hours into the game, these get outright genius, while still being more than possible for someone like me, a bit of an idiot. They manage to do this by splitting the bigger puzzles into smaller sections so as not to overwhelm us. That then together, connected in a small simple way, create huge, almost Rube Goldberg level machines that open the path ahead. They are immensely gratifying to do, not only to complete but also just to try and complete. The game has wonderful feedback in the form of sound and visuals to help you along. Outside of the combat, these puzzles are my favorite part of the game. For some, they go too far. All of this together with the exploration and movement creates something pretty special, something I haven't really encountered since. Puzzles are scattered around the open world, some leading to huge secrets with their own secrets hidden within. A secret within a secret, a bit of a lost art. Overall, the gameplay loop here is outright amazing, and unlike any other JRPG I've ever played. Some come close in select categories, but none of them manage to be both fast and expressive in its combat and smart and satisfying when we get to the puzzles. All of it wrapped up in a story that makes you really think. A big part of roaming around the open world here, like in most other RPGs, is tackling side quests and the inevitable grind for levels. If you, like me, despise grinding just to progress with the story, I've got some great news for you. You don't really need to grind here at all. Leveling in CrossCode only grants you points to upgrade your character, giving small stat boosts and occasionally unlocking new abilities. The real source of your power, especially in the early game, comes from your gear. If you decide to push ahead with the story before you're technically ready, the game's scaling mechanics will quickly bring you up to the appropriate level. Higher level enemies give you just the experience you need, so there's no requirement to treat this like a traditional MMORPG or JRPG, grinding endlessly or completing fetch quests just to keep playing, unless you're really struggling with something and need to overlevel. That said, I recommend giving some of the side quests a shot. While a big handful of them are fairly generic, most of them offer worthwhile rewards, whether in the form of useful gear, fun challenges, or even small bits of world building. Almost all of the side quests add to the story of CrossWorlds, the game within the game, instead of CrossCode, the game we're playing, which nicely fleshes out the world within the world. It makes the MMORPG CrossWorlds more believable. A standout early on is the A Promise is a Promise questline. In this one, we meet a weird-looking guy in an alley in Rookie Harbor who asks for help finding some kind of broken gear. This leads us to solving a riddle and facing a special variation of the hedgehog enemy, a blue one this time, an obvious Easter egg. The quest culminates in a mini-boss fight, and it rewards us with some items and XP. CrossCode is packed with quests like this, and about half of them end up being memorable in one way or another. I'll highlight more of these standout moments as we go, but for now on, let's move on. Autumn's Rise is a pretty big area, but it doesn't have much outside of exploration and combat. Lots of side quests lead us out here in search of something or someone. As an example, a quest line spanning the entire game starts here. An awkward scientist needs our help collecting data, killing a couple of each enemy and hitting most of the plant types. We also need to find this data probe. This is a very simple quest, but it's almost always just in the background when we start a new area, and acts as a great way to earn some extra XP. Moving through Autumn's Rise, we enter the Bergen Trail. We, the Seeker, must pass through this trail on our way to Bergen Village and the Temple Mine, as a part of the main questline of CrossWorlds. Bergen looks pretty good, darker greens that fade into white snow. It's a bit harsh on the eyes sometimes, specifically when we see the abyss below, but most of the time it just looks as good as the previous locations. It ranks rather low on the overall list though, I have to admit that. There are a couple of new additions here in terms of movement, namely these jump pads, but it's also significantly more vertical than Autumn's Rise. As we enter the Bergen Trail, we're stopped by Apollo, the grass-headed spheromancer who accused us of cheating a while ago. He wants to fight us, to prove he's better than us or something. This is our first PvP fight in CrossCode, and it plays a bit differently from most other boss encounters in the game. Apollo moves rather quickly, and instead of a single boss health bar, we have to win a best of 9. First to 5 wins takes the title. This fight is pretty good, and going for the 5-0 victory just to show the arrogant tryhard his place is a lot of fun. There are no real problems with this fight, but later on the PvP fights get a bit less fair. This one is rather easy, but still a challenge if you want the total victory over him. We beat his brakes off and he challenges us to another duel in the future. It's about time for Emily to log off, and just before she does we get a new word. Bye. We have also played the game for a long time now, so we also log off CrossWorlds. Bergen Trail introduces a couple of new enemies, most notable being snowmen that deal huge amounts of damage, especially up close, and goats that only take damage from the back. Google goat backshots if you want to know more. There are also bunnies. Cute. Bergen Village is pretty huge, a rest stop before we enter the first dungeon since the tutorial. We go get permission from the village mayor to enter the first dungeon. A mine that impeded on the ancients, that in turn started to fight back. We're to clear the mine and help the village get back to mining. We get a call from Lucas, the German-sounding guy from the beginning of the game who toured us through Rookie Harbor. He wants us to join his guild, the First Scholars. At the guild house we meet most of the rest of the members. Raphael, the tri-blader with a sense of humor that doesn't take much seriously. Lynn, or Linda, the motherly quadro guard, and Albert, the stern but nice hexacaster. With the addition of Leah and Emily, the First Scholars would now have all 5 classes. But there's a catch. Before we can join, we need to pass a quiz on the Ancients. As it turns out, the First Scholars is a group of lore lovers that won't include just any old gamer. To get these answers, we need to complete the dungeon in Bergen, but before all that though, we should go do some side quests. A temple in the village is filled with monks. Here we get a couple of challenges that help us gain experience for the dungeons. This is a completely optional set of tests, but they're very fun and grants lots of XP, so I'd recommend them to just about anyone. They're also pretty hard and introduce a new concept: ice. The ice in CrossWorlds works like it does in any other game. We slide on it. Here it often makes its way into movement challenges, which makes them slightly harder, because gaining speed on ice is a lot harder than it is on solid ground. This is a fun mechanic, but it can also be pretty frustrating, especially some parts of this test where enemies can knock you off too. After finishing these tests, we can do them again, but with added limitations and extra challenges. These are pretty goddamn hard actually. Continuing the quest line from the weird guy in an alley, we go fetch another broken weapon, this time in a cave filled with penguins. There's a pretty challenging parkour puzzle here, followed by a fun fight against a DJ penguin. There's a fun quest clearing out a mine from ants here too. At the Bergen Guardian HQ, basically the police station, we get tasked with chasing down a goat on the roof of one of the buildings in the village. This is a wild goose chase, but more of a puzzle than anything. Finding the right way to get on top of the roof takes some serious forethought. Once we catch the goat, we turn it into one of the guards and go back to HQ. As it turns out though, this guard was an imposter. He was kinda sus. We chase him down and work through another dungeon to hear his stupid villain's speech. Turns out he's controlling and optimizing goats because he likes them, I guess? There's a boss fight here, more goats, and then the goats overthrow their human overlord. The goat gives us their thanks, but also reminds us that we mercilessly kill their friends and that the blood of countless goats is on our hands. They'll forgive us this time though, so we're free to leave. Honestly, I love this sort of storytelling. What began as a simple, almost mundane quest to get a goat off a roof spiraled into an absurd yet oddly meaningful plot about power, rebellion, and unintended consequences. We didn't end up as triumphant heroes. We're goat massacring bad guys who narrowly escaped judgment. It's ridiculous, it's darkly funny, and it's really good. Entering the dungeon of the area, the mine, we're introduced to a couple of new puzzle pieces. Big movable boxes and the directional arrows that guide our shots when we hit them. I spent an embarrassing amount of time in this very specific room, where there are boxes with the new arrows that guide our shots, but finally figuring it all out was super satisfying. Most of the puzzles at this point are simple, but there are exceptions. The gimmick of the dungeon, however, isn't these boxes or arrows. No, the real gimmick is the bombs. These bombs fly a bit after being hit and explode a while after that. We use this to clear the way in increasingly clever ways. I do wish it was easier to tell exactly what direction these were going after we hit them, but it always works out in the end with some trial and error. There are a couple of enemies here that are specifically vulnerable to bombs, ants and a couple of robots. Ice is then introduced into simple puzzles, making them a step more involved, but still very much simple. We're also introduced to the fire that can clear up ice. It also does pretty massive damage to most of the enemies down here, and makes the bombs act in other ways. The movement challenges with the fire are pretty annoying if you don't get it down the first time. These are harder versions of the ones we did in the monk tests. The mid-dungeon boss is a powered-up version of one of the robots, a fine fight with set fire points around the room. This is the point where we unlock the heat mode, our first elemental power. Our moveset is effectively double with the addition of fire-based attacks, and we're granted with a substantial number of points to allocate to a new branch in the skill tree. These skills, while straightforward, add significant variety to gameplay. They generally fall into two categories: simple stat boosts or special abilities. These include ranged specials. Maybe it's a flamethrower for the heat element or just a flurry of balls for the neutral mode. Dodge specials that superpower our evasion skills. There's the special shield. These vary like the others, and I don't find myself using them a whole bunch. I'm not the biggest shield user overall because of its placement on the controller. Finally, we have the normal special attacks. This is almost always just a DPS thing that does lots of damage. There are two of each on each element plus the neutral ones. This is a lot of customization actually. We can upgrade these further to use more special meters. These often become completely new attacks and not simple upgrades to their earlier and cheaper versions. Once again, there are a lot of options here, and once you unlock one of them, you can just switch to the other one, so there's nothing to miss out on here. Puzzles now use both bombs, fire elements, icy floors, and moving platforms. They're still digestible, but definitely more complex. Some are pretty big, but they're almost always split into smaller, more manageable pieces. Some are also pretty quick, but at this point they shouldn't be a problem. The main boss of this area is a lot of fun. A big robot with big telegraphed attacks. Some of his ice attacks, especially those that follow you, do feel kind of overtuned. These do massive damage and stay longer than they should. Other than that though, I think the fight is pretty simple. Shoot the bombs so they hit the robot's weak point, breaking it, leaving them open for a big punish. As I said, it's a fun fight for the most part that also looks super with lots of details within this pixel art, with its only downside being some of the lingering hitboxes. If we're fast enough in this dungeon, we win our first dungeon maze against Emily. She's kind of shaken. Turns out she hates bugs. We get the blue ice shade, the first milestone, and our next goal, the cold element located in the next dungeon in the Maroon Valley. We read up on some of the lore in the last room of the dungeon so we can ace that quiz back at the scholars. But there's a pretty obvious problem here. We can't speak. Leah is understandably terrified of the quiz now that she remembers it. But Emily just passed and it's our turn next. We're presented with a seemingly simple question. The yarrow is one of the gods of shape. Now, what shape did he represent? Leah looks visibly upset. Unfortunately, we can only respond with one of our 3 programmed words. Lynn, slightly thrown off, repeats the question. What shape does the arrow represent? Leah's expression grows even more disheartened. It's clear that something is wrong, but all we can do is say one of our 3 programmed words. The first scholars finally understand that something isn't right. Leah can't speak. Her speech module isn't working. Lynn isn't just going to give us the pass to join the guild though, so she makes the quiz multiple choice. This is a terrific moment of character building. Seeing Leah as we do here makes your heart drop just a bit. She doesn't deserve to be ridiculed like this. But the scholars are seemingly great people, so they adjust. We're added to the roster, we're now part of a guild and log off for the day. We've played for a long time. After logging in, we get a new set of words. Why and how. We can now kind of ask questions. We go to the desert, Maroon Valley, but before that, Citron, the other new recruit, gives us a call. But we'll get to him later. Maroon Valley looks very different to Bergen. It's rather boring compared to the others, especially when there's no greenery at all. There's a new movement mechanic here, jump pads that fling us across gaps. We'll be using these a lot in the open world. There are lots of hidden areas here. Some of these areas are on the verge to ridiculous, having to backtrack multiple levels worth to unlock truly hidden areas. New enemies include scorpions that look like crabs. These are the basic Goomba of this place. There's the sand sharks that only take damage when they emerge from the sand. This is a fun gimmick for the most part, but it can feel frustrating when there's a lot of them. Lastly is the sandworm. These are basically just tanks, and they very rarely even get to hit you. In the greener areas of the Maroon Valley, there's a flying thing that is super annoying and a rock with a face, but we barely fight these. The main town of the valley is Bakikum, a ridiculous name. And just like Bergen Village, it's kind of a hub for side quests and the home of the Shad, the people of this place. Turns out that before we're allowed to enter the temple and get our next element, we need to clear out a cave under a tree, infested with sandworms. Throughout our time exploring the sandy valley, Emily has opened up to us. She speaks about her real-life responsibilities, homework and class. Emily urges Leah to open up a bit, to talk to her. First of all, how the hell hasn't Emily figured out that Leah can't speak yet? This is a bit too big of a hole in the plot to me. Basically everyone else has figured it out by now. Second of all, we don't know Leah very well either. Actually, that's not entirely true. One thing CrossCode does remarkably well is character building. There's also a lot of character we can influence here. Nothing major, but still significant. Let's start with the obvious. Leah is pretty smug, especially if you're doing good. If we do well in the tutorial, for example, Leah will act smug and proud towards Sergey. She's a very competitive person after all. She strives to win against Emily in the dungeon races, the fights against Apollo, and in side quests. And when she does well there, she acts just as smug there. After leaving the ship in the introduction of the game, we get our first confidant, Emily. She's the opposite of Leah in many ways. Not shy, extremely open, but also just as competitive. We join a guild, but not without problems. She's basically mute after all, but they accept her for what she is. They're kind and respectful. In turn, she starts to trust in them. Leah can't tell us much about herself. Instead, she shows her personality by reacting to others. This is a very different way of building a character, and it wouldn't work if they weren't partially or completely mute. But here, it works incredibly well. Emily said something here that hits a bit too close to home for Leah while speaking about her life outside CrossWorlds. She talks about how her friends talk down CrossWorlds. It's just a game, a plaything, something for kids, a waste of time. What Emily doesn't know is that, as far as Leah knows, this is her entire existence for now. And Emily, one of the few people she would call her friend, unknowingly belittles her entire life. Emily knows there's something wrong, but we can't talk to her about it. There's a sweet moment as we exit the main quest hub of Bakikum. Leah affirms that Emily isn't bothering her and that Leah enjoys her company. All of this is a bit too much for Leah. She demands answers from Sergey about her real life, outside of the game, where she goes when she's booted offline. We see a new Leah here for the first time. She's mad. Sergey has no other choice here but to tell us the truth. Leah is in a comatose state. This is the twist we all saw coming. Maybe not a coma itself, but that there's something wrong with her situation outside of the game. This isn't what Leah wanted to hear. She's distraught, but there's hope. By playing the game, Sergey says we might recover our memories and, in turn, be able to wake up in the real world, the one outside of CrossWorlds. We log off for the night. When we log in again, we meet up with Citron. Emily isn't online just yet. Citron is a noticeable change of pace from Emily. He's less competitive and far quieter. He's also kind of a nerd. Together we clear out a cave beneath the tree and face a very simple mini-boss, a massive version of the sandworms we've been fighting so far. This is when Emily logs in again. She's going to have to do that mission all by herself, while we go do some other side content. By this point in the game, the side quests are starting to feel a bit repetitive. There are a few standout exceptions, like catching the corrupt guard stealing from the market, but beyond that I didn't pursue many in this area. The Broken Weapons questline continues though, and it leads us to some exciting moments. Using a special pirate coin we unlock a secret area of the map. Inside we tackle a few puzzles and face off against a mini-boss, a shark. This is easily one of my favorite mini-bosses in the game. The fight is engaging, with a unique mechanic requiring us to fill a treasure chest to remove the shark's armor. Definitely a highlight. Returning the third item to the mysterious quest giver of the Broken Weapons questline finally reveals his true motives. Turns out he's a veteran player who started the game during its closed beta. He used the game as a way to connect with his kids as they grew older and moved out and started to lead their own lives. With all 5 broken weapons, he'd have an excuse to gather his family again, and then maybe you could finally complete the questline they once began together. It's a heartfelt story about a father trying to reconnect with his children, but lacking the courage to do so without a specific reason. This revelation gives the questline unexpected emotional weight and depth. I like this one a lot. It leaves you with more of a lasting impression than most of the others. The Grasshead challenges us to another duel, but like previous times, he refuses to call us by our name. This angers Leah, because Leah values the little things she can't control while trapped in this virtual world, so Apollo not even having the decency to call her by her name makes her feel like less of a human. The least people could do is make her feel real in this world. Call her by her name. Leah isn't some NPC. This duel is harder than the one before, adding the heat element to both our and Apollo's arsenal. It's lots of fun too. Going for the 5-0 took me almost half an hour. The dungeon of this area introduces a lot of stuff. It's a pretty big step up in terms of puzzles, both in terms of quality, but also in terms of difficulty. Switches tied to pillars that change elevation, bubbles that explode into steam when hit. We also start to use ice. We fall into quicksand and combine all of these with fans to do some pretty advanced stuff. It's also pretty goddamn quick. In terms of enemies, there's also a couple of new ones here. Jellyfish that shoot bubbles that explode into steam at us, which also happens to be their biggest weakness, steam. There's also moths. These can only be broken when they are above you, so use the newly introduced pillars to shoot them. This feels a bit awkward at first, but it quickly starts to make sense. The mid-dungeon boss this time around is pretty simple actually. Basically just a jellyfish that can't move. It's pretty fun. We unlock the ice element. This element feels a bit like the glass cannon of the game. I tend to use it a lot, and its side effects slows enemies down. The actual boss of the area is a giant moth. This boss is very tough. First of all, it looks awesome, just like every other one so far. The gimmick here is to hit the moth using the pillar in the middle of the arena. This gets pretty hard because the boss does some serious damage. Using items here helps, especially in the second phase, but the constant fire damage from debuffs is pretty stressful. After the first phase, the moth moves to another platform after being broken by our charged shots. This is the single worst part of the fight. You have to build a path in the lava using your ice shots on the bubbles the boss spawns. What makes it worse though is that if you fail, the boss resets the entire phase. This feels like total bullshit, and the least they could have done is make sure the moth spawns more than enough bubbles. And that's the dungeon. All in all, this dungeon took me almost 2 hours. That's actually pretty crazy, but they're almost always excellent to the point where this is the main selling point of the game. The dungeons are spectacular both in terms of combat and puzzles, and the later ones expand on this even more. Some get a bit too crazy, but we'll get to those. We win the race against Emily, who is shook by the amount of bugs in there. She hates those things. Leah goes in for the hug. This is new. Leah can't speak, so she tries to comfort her friend in other ways. We'll see this expanded later on. Emily tries, again, to get Leah to open up. Citron makes sure she finally figures out Leah can't speak. It was about time. She feels pretty stupid. Our two guild friends log out, and so do we. But this time, we initiate it ourselves. Boom. Character building. The dream we usually see is more involved this time around. People talking about things we don't understand. But we also run around in a cave. Then into the place from the intro. The Japanese-looking place, somewhere in the playground. Sergey is name-dropped, but nothing really meaningful. Seems like he's holding back something. When we log back in, we learn we've been out cold for 3 days because of technical difficulties. But we get a new word in return. Wait. Turns out we're going on our first raid with our guild, but to get there we need to finish a pretty big intermission quest. We go back to Autumn's Fall to catch a holographic rabbit. But it's not the same Autumn's Fall we ran through in the opening areas. It's a separate part of it, with most of the same enemies just jacked up to the max. It's a very puzzle-heavy open world segment, which works pretty well here, but some of the combat segments felt overtuned. I died in a very specific one a lot more than I think I should have. Hiding behind a wall helped, but it didn't feel very good. If you want to know more, just Google Autumn Falls on your work computer. Finally, we fight the rabbit. This earns us the key to enter the next segment of the map, the jungle. The raid itself is pretty exciting actually. A lot of great combat with a simple gimmick, disabling and fighting specific enemies in a specific order. We're split into teams of 2 and we have to communicate with the other 3 members of the raid. The last fight is especially fun, but just as we're supposed to teleport to the epic conclusion, the final boss, something goes awry. We're teleported to somewhere high up in Bergen. The blue weird guy from the opening is back, and this time he really wants to beat you. He wants to give us the, quote, ultimate experience, unquote. He wants to try out some challenges before he ends us. This boss fight is crazy. The health bar on the bottom has over 15 segments. It's obviously a fight we won't win in any normal kind of way, but for now, all we can do is give Sergey enough time to make something happen. The fight plays a lot more like a 1v1 with Apollo. There are some more generic boss attacks here too, but a lot of them use a whole suite of different elements. I've always been against scripted fights, but this is a very meta fight in the first place. This is obviously a special entity in the game CrossWorlds and in the game we're playing CrossCode, so I can't be as mad at it. We lose. The ultimate experience seems to be too much for us. We wake up in a new location, a futuristic looking apartment, maybe a hotel, maybe a Swedish prison. It's not as colorful as we're used to. This is a place we've seen in our dreams. Sergey is still with us, but we're locked in. A new character walks in. He looks more rugged than the others so far in the game, like he's not really a part of the game at all. His name is Gotham, and Sergey knows him. He asks us if we remember anything, then leaves. Sergey gives us some much needed backstory. Gotham is a former colleague of Sergey who went missing. He promises to tell us more, so let's move on for now. Walking outside, we're faced with a new location, the Vermilion Wasteland, a dark, gloomy place with purple, almost bloody water, oppressive, dark architecture, and Lucas, our guild friend. He doesn't have any more information about this place than we do. We go to the quest hub of the area, but instead of a lore dump and well-executed cutscene, the quest giver just kind of explains what we have to do as quickly as possible and sends us on our way. This area has a couple of new enemies, but they're truly nothing special. The fighting is very vanilla outside of some enemies that have to be pushed into others. These are a lot of fun and they work really well when you finally understand their gimmick, which I didn't for a long time. We meet a high-level enemy. The scaling feels pretty weird, but it's obviously on purpose. We have Lucas with us who can finish them off for us. Finishing up the quest, all we get at the end is an out-of-place room. Hyper-modern. Clean. It doesn't mean anything to us yet. Returning the quest to the quest giver, he just gives us another duplicate version of it. Again, very lazy, but it's on purpose. This place is very unfinished and unpolished, not in terms of the game CrossCode, but in the world of CrossWorlds. We're done for the day and Lucas logs out, only to return a second later. This nightmare scenario is starting to take form. Lucas is now stuck in the game too. He also can't remember his life outside of it. Strangely familiar to Leah. And asking around, no one else can remember anything either. At least we don't die in real life when we die in game. Sergey gives us some more information about this place, a long forgotten and abandoned area of CrossWorlds that was dropped early in development, far out of reach of the rest of the official playground. Sergey also gives us more of his backstory. The lean guy from our dreams, Satoshi, who also happens to be your brother, Gotham, the ruffled guy, Sergey and Leah all worked for Instatainment, the creators of CrossWorlds, about 5 years ago. Then, about 4 or so years ago, Satoshi, Gotham and you went missing. You're found in a hospital, and you're logged in now from your comatose state to help Sergey find the other two by remembering your past from in-game experiences. This is very, very complicated, and the game doesn't do the best job at making it more digestible either, but it's not bad. On the contrary, actually this is a pretty cool premise. Returning after sleeping in our cell, we continue our underwhelming quest. There's nothing we can do today though. For some reason, they timed the quest and we can't continue until tomorrow. Instead, we get another tour from the tour guide Lucas. He shares us up a bit, just like in the Rookie Harbor at the beginning of the game. There's some back and forth here, between the two, and a look at a giant tower looming over the wasteland, probably the dungeon of this area. Once again, we turn in for the night. We wake up to someone barging into the barracks. It's the girl from the intro, Shizuka. Shizuka looks just like us, but is a lot less friendly. She's extremely aggressive towards us and wants answers just as badly as we want them. She refreshes our memories. We are a copy. A copied version of Shizuka's avatar in the game. Leah is an AI. A program. And we will never be able to leave the game. The coma? A lie. Our memories? Copies. Everything is our fault, and we shouldn't even exist. The Leah we see here is new. Completely gone. Sergey tries to calm us down, tell us that what she said is a lie. Leah is unresponsive, her short life within the servers of CrossWorlds flashing before her. We see past versions of her left unresponsive by the revelation she's a programmed mind. This time it's different though. She's mad. Betrayed by the person she thought was on her side this entire time. We make sure that Sergey doesn't talk to us, and we return to our mission as best we can. The Leah that meets up with Lucas is extremely uncomfortable to look at. She has a blank stare in her eyes, a sad, neutral expression on her face. It's almost harrowing to see the previously happy, sometimes snarky character almost entirely cold. No music plays from this point onwards. The game wants you to just sit with this revelation for a while. After minutes of agonizing silence, the game finally lets Leah feel the overflowing emotions triggered by Lucas talking about getting out of the Vermilion Wasteland. And in turn, the game. Seeing Leah like this is truly heartbreaking. A music track finally ends the silence. A beautiful, sad piano. Lucas, the only person in the wasteland that she actually trusts, starts speaking about the other guild members, people who care about us. Leah is still very hopeless, but not completely cold. Continuing the questline of the area, we find a room at the end of a small dungeon. It's Lucas' room from his real life. Leah finally emotes some more here. Sure, it's at Lucas's expense, but the two feel less hopeless now. The two reflect upon their stay in the Vermilion Wasteland, and Lucas hits a bit too close to home. What if there's no real life anymore? To Leah, this is a reality, but Lucas has another way of looking at it. Why does that make this life, the one we're living right now inside of the game, any less meaningful? I think they tried to make this moment a bit more than it was, and I can't really say it hits home just as well as some of the others here. Once again, we go to sleep. Someone new barges into our room. A guy in a business suit. He looks like an avatar unlike the ruffled guy from before. He's here to apologize for our meeting with Shizuka, but also to try and find out who put us here in the game in the first place. We can't tell him because we can't talk. So he leaves. Sergey can't talk to us the normal way, so we go to the dungeon. The way there is a highlight, a stealth segment. This plays very well. It might be a bit too heavy on trial and error, but as I said, for a one-off like this, it works extremely well. This dungeon is special. It starts out like any other, but our goal is only to make it to a very specific place where we can quite literally break it. This is a great gameplay segment. A couple of fun puzzles, then we fly through the walls, breaking the fourth wall of the game, going into the other instances of the dungeon, trying to make it to the same instance as Lucas. About halfway there, we're found out by the blue avatar. This escape segment is really good. We run and puzzle at the same time until we reach a boss fight. This boss has billions upon billions of hit points, so Sergey gives us hacks. This fight is really fun. Seeing your attack numbers go so high, the number almost obstructs our screen. I like this reminder that we're in a game. Also, I like the fact that we haven't been this powerful all this time because of the anti-cheat. Maybe Valve should take some notes. We make it to Lucas and finally escape. Except Lucas can't follow us. He's been frozen by the blue avatar. We escape without him at his command. The captain of the ship from the beginning of the game is back somehow, and we're back on his ship. This time, only half as confused as last time. We get some more exposition from Sergey, just what we needed. We are in fact an AI, a so-called evotar, made by Satoshi without the permission of his bosses that didn't want them in the game. Made by copying other players' minds to simulate specific parts of the human brain, in turn making completely sentient beings. And we're special. We survived the realization that we're a program, a revelation that left the previous versions in a malfunctioning state. This is all a bit much, so we take some time to wander around the ship. There's a fun bit here about the material Lee and other avatars are made out of. Instant matter being super light and their weakness of water. A moment to relieve some pressure. Sergey changes his goal at this point. Before, he only wanted to find his friends, but now he sees the humanity inside evotars, and instead, our goal will be to create a proper place for evotars, where they can live without hiding. Leah seems hopeful, almost touched by this, and our next official goal, in CrossCode, not CrossWorlds, is to find Shizuka's brother Satoshi, our creator. Vermilion Wasteland is packed. There's some genuinely great stuff here. The reveal was pretty predictable. The entire game built up to something like this with the dream segments, but it's still a shock. Not only is Leah an AI, but she shouldn't even exist. And this isn't her first run through the game. She's been used. I wish there were more references to this somewhere. Subtle things like NPCs recognizing us or something. We don't know the extent of it, maybe we've only been revived in a lab before this, but something like that would make it even more disturbing. I also really enjoy the escape. It's a very scripted series of events, but it's also a lot of fun. It's not all great though. There's a lot of stuff here. Way too much actually, and it dilutes the game quite a bit, lessening the other parts of the Vermilion Wasteland. It's just loaded with exposition, and I don't think it needed to be. Let some of this be a mystery to us for a bit longer, so we can enjoy the amazing parts of this instead. Just a thought. We meet up with Emily in the guild headquarters. She isn't happy to say the least. We left her hanging in the middle of the raid and she wants answers. We've been online but never answered any of their messages. But Leah, we are mute. And all we can do is stand there and take it. She isn't as accommodating here as she usually is, and it makes sense. She's frustrated with the one-sided conversations, and the leaving in the middle of the raid was one step too far. Lucas, somehow, not trapped in the Vermilion Wasteland, walks into the room. Leah is obviously shocked by this and goes in for the hug. Turns out this isn't the same Lucas we left behind in the Vermilion Wasteland. He was another evotar, a copy. Made to be experimented on or something. Our next goal is simple, keep progressing in CrossWorlds until we make it to Sapphire Ridge. Before we can enter Gaia's garden, we have to fight the Grasshead again. This is the fight where I think it goes a bit too far. Apollo does a crazy amount of damage and he can stunlock us into long combos. I had to really try for almost 40 minutes straight to get the 5-0. Some of the phases are so hard I had to try and cheese the boss using the ice element to slow him down and then the fire element to do damage over time, combined with buffing before entering the arena. This works pretty well, but it's still really hard, and the buffing feels a bit unintended because we can't buff in the middle of the fight. Apollo and his friend finally notice something is wrong, so instead of doing their usual "I will surely beat you next time, Spheromancer Leah," we team up for the next couple of quests. Gaia's Garden is a jungle. It looks super good for the most part, lots of greens and color overall. The exploration has been turned up to the max. It's not quite as involved as the Maroon Valley, but there's some serious exploration here, and a lot more of it than the previous locations. Most of it is just as good as Autumn's Rise, but there are some places where it goes a bit too far. Some places are obscured not on purpose, unless they are, but by the flora and fauna. Gaia's Garden has a couple of new enemies, a parrot with a minigun. This one is a bit annoying to fight, so I almost always just run past them. The cats are fun though. Their gimmick is that you take damage if you're too close. These work really well. There are a couple of others, a slime, a flying fish and a piranha plant. One section of the map is corrupted. The indigenous Shad people blames the people in the big city and their machinery. We're going to have to help them with this problem before we get to the area dungeon. They happen to be protesting just in our way. This little detour is very weird and definitely out of place. It's also very short. We go into the infested part of the village, take out a couple of cats, and that's it. The source of the corruption seems to be just a pillar in a basement. It doesn't really mean anything to us right now. Basin Keep, a cyberpunk city in the middle of the jungle, is the main quest hub of Gaia's Garden. A favorite side quest of mine here is the hostage situation. We try but can't really talk down the perpetrators because we can't talk. So we have to take out the minigun wielding parrots to free the hostages. This gets pretty hard, but taking your time and learning to bank your shots well is a must. Another highlight is a quest in a cave not too far out of town. There's a full-blown tower defense segment built into the game. Stuff like this is always fun. Genre breaks that make little sense but still manages to play surprisingly well. The Broken Weapon questline continues. This time we need to find the secret code. The Konami code of course, but with a single change so people just couldn't randomly open the door. But this entrance itself is also hidden behind a tree, a secret within a secret. I've always been a fan of those. After a puzzle or two, we fight a boss. It's a bit annoying because it has way too much health, but other than that it's fine. Only one broken item remains. Finishing up the collection quest, like all the others before, we're met with a new character. It isn't the stuttering nerd that usually greets us, but instead a CrossWorlds moderator. The quest giver of the collection questline isn't an NPC, but a player with seemingly malicious intent. But I guess we'll figure that out later. We get a call from Citron. He wants to meet up to do the dungeon race, and we accept. We meet him outside of the dungeon. Emily's also here. With Citron as a mediator, we finally make up. This is a great moment. We didn't leave the raid on purpose, we didn't block them or ignore their messages, and we miss them both very much. The two bawled their eyes out. Leah saying hi over and over to respond to Emily's crying is so sweet. Again, a great moment. Gaia's Garden's dungeon is split up into 3 separate ones. The first 2 are there to introduce 2 new elements, the last one acting as the ultimate challenge, the Grand Kriskajo, or whatever it's called. The one on the left is the shock dungeon. These puzzles get complicated. Using magnets to move boxes, shock balls to activate pylons and enemies that are weak to either shock or magnets. Putting all of these together, then adding a timing element, sometimes an aiming one too, makes these puzzles seriously amazing. I have never played a top-down Zelda game, but if they even get halfway as complicated as these do, I'd be very impressed with Nintendo. Some people think this is a problem. I don't agree, but I do see why it could be. I figured these out relatively quickly and got stuck on some of the enemy encounters for a few minutes instead. People who are better at the combat part of the game and look forward to that part of the gameplay loop could start dreading these complicated but undeniably well-crafted puzzles. And I get that. There are combat peaks here too, don't worry. The boss by the end of the dungeon is a big slime. At this point we also have the electric element. This boss is a bit harder than I think it should be, but once you figure it out, you can keep hitting back the electric balls, the main gimmick of the fight. It gets a whole lot easier. His shield that blocks these attacks isn't very visible in the middle of the action. It just kind of looks like another particle effect, which is a bit sucky. The dungeon took me just under an hour, which is pretty crazy. This is only one of 3 connected ones. The wave dungeon on the right is focused around teleporting around, both objects and our player character using the wave element and using the balls to solve puzzles. These, just like in the shock dungeon, get very tricky and often feel extremely hard to figure out without endless trial and error. What CrossCode does well here though is sort these into smaller, more manageable puzzles that together make something huge and sprawling. There's a fun new enemy here, a chicken that gets confused when we teleport. Good stuff. We get the wave element to, 25 hours into the game, finalize our loadout. This one feels a bit more specific than the other 3, being more specialized to having high health and recovering health. The others are supposed to be specialized too, but they feel very powerful in almost all stats. They do feel weak in certain areas, but never outright specialized in others. Fire was supposed to be a short-ranged skill and ice a defensive one. Shock is all about evasion apparently. I say apparently because reading the wiki I could have never guessed that shock was anything else than a counter, like all the other elements frankly. The wave element though feels very weak when fighting, but works wonders when you need to live. The boss fight in the wave dungeon is a ghost that only takes damage after breaking through his shield with the wave balls from the puzzles from before. We fight plenty of weaker versions of this guy in the dungeon before this one, so he's no problem at all. This dungeon also took me just under an hour, and it easily, just like the shock dungeon, fits into my top 5 in the entire game. Before we can do the last dungeon, the shock and wave dual dungeon, we need to get rid of the shock cats, the shock-based cats, once and for all. Turns out they're back, and the protesters pick the entrance to the final dungeon as their new spot to hang out. With a scientist at our side, we take out more pillars, but this time they expand more and more, leading us into the corrupted forest and further into a cave. This cave segment frankly doesn't work all that well. You have to jump across pillars that are hard to read the height of, and the last part made me feel stupid. At the end of the cave there's a boss fight, and one I don't like all that much either. It's an upgraded version of the Behemoth, a normal enemy we've fought in the open world before, but now it has a huge katana and more health. This doesn't work all that well, and fighting it patiently isn't very fun. This fight was very samey and took over 5 minutes of just hitting it over and over. We patch the hole that caused all the problems and head back to the dungeon. The combined dungeon is probably the best in the entire game, or at least the best one so far by an entire IGN point. The puzzles here are immaculate, combining both elements together in simply flawless ways. I love this place. It's broken up by a boss fight against an ape. This fight is a bit tedious. It might partially be my fault, I didn't have the best equipment here and the fight felt slower than it should have been. That's perpetuated by the fact that half of the time you break the boss you have to do damage with the wave element to get the most out of it, which isn't that great at dealing damage. The fight outside of that is pretty great. The monkey is fast but still fairly easy to predict. It plays a little like the later one-on-ones against Apollo in that way, but with less bullshit. The dungeon continues. We're atop a massive tree, climbing and climbing, working through more mind-bending, fast and expertly crafted puzzles until we make it to the very, very top. There's a fight here against one too many shock cats that feels a bit too much. I really had to lock in here and use a couple of items to make it through. It felt a bit overtuned in that way. On the crown of the tree itself, we meet the monkey again. This time he's riding on a big whale. This is a pretty amazing boss. Some of the larger sweeping attacks feel a bit unfair because of their size, but most of them are very much avoidable. Fighting the whale first is a waiting game. Break him, make the monkey shock the pillar that spawns and do damage. Then it becomes another 1v1 versus the monkey. This time their attacks are upgraded. These are all fun to avoid and work well. I wish again that it wasn't so focused on the wave element though. You can't do much damage here, especially if you have the upgrade that pushes them away. Like me. The arena fucks with us here too. If you push him off, your damage will be stifled by quite a bit. The fight's biggest flaw is its runtime. This will sound contradictory in a while, but it gets draining. I fought this guy for almost 15 minutes straight. 13 minutes 40 something seconds without the face transitions and intro dialogue. This is about 5 minutes too long. I like bosses just as much as the next guy, but lowering the health by about 20 or so % feels appropriate. Maybe I was underleveled or I didn't have the best gear at this point, but it still felt too long. And that's it. We have now finally unlocked Sapphire Ridge, the place from our literal dreams. Back at the Scholars HQ, we're invited to another raid, but we have to decline because of the loophole in CrossWorlds code that made the Vermilion Wasteland part of the game possible. Sapphire Ridge is a Japanese-inspired location complete with torii gates, lanterns hanging from bridges, and bamboo forests. Everything has a sort of bluish-purple tint on it, and unlike the other locations in the game, it's dark. It's always night here. This place looks great, but some parts of it are annoying. The exploration here is amazing, but a bit too backtracky compared to some of the other places, except maybe Maroon Valley. Hidden areas are plentiful here. Some are really tricky to figure out. The ones where you have to run and parkour across the torii gates specifically can be pretty hard to figure out. Unlike the other locations so far though, Sapphire Ridge have some serious rewards for this exploration. There is a lot of equipment to be found in the hidden and out of place chests, weapons and armor that prove to be a big upgrade to what we have at this point in the game, unless you have been trading like crazy. Enemies here include samurai beetles that do massive damage, pandas that are annoying to kill because of their massive health pool, and nearly harmless spiders or ants found in the cave segments. These enemies are nothing special at this point, outside of maybe the beetles, because of how quick they are. The collection quest continues. The player that faked being an NPC to seemingly hack into the game is somewhere close. The boss fight against this nerd is fine, and it turns out he actually is an NPC and that this entire questline was a secret quest made by early testers of the game as a little thank you from the developers. It's a nice nod, but a pretty boring end to the almost game-spanning questline we've been working towards. But there are some good side quests here. One of the most memorable in the entire game actually, a quest called An Unfortunate Series of Features. We meet Kit, a player that needs help with a glitch. We meet up with Kit in the Maroon Valley, where she has changed her skin to something we've never seen before in the game, a fursuit-looking cat. We glitch through a wall and enter an unfinished dev area, probably made by some overconfident interns apparently. The puzzles here are familiar, but all the assets used make little to no sense. We go down sinkholes that teleport us up, we jump on flying fruit crates and so on. Kit doesn't bother, instead just jumping across it all with an actual glitch in CrossCode. Now made canon in the game within the game, CrossWorlds. If you, the player, also do this, we get a nod from Kit, which is cool. The boss here is okay. I think the circumstances of it all make it special, but the fight itself is a bit lackluster. A weird looking platform with eyes that use, again, familiar attacks with weird twists. This fight is very hard, so I went back to finish it later, but yeah, that's it for this quest. It's a cool meta nod to the fact that we're in a game, but honestly, not really more than that. Again though, this is really cool. Before we can proceed to the next area, we need to finish a quest, complete the Golden Bug challenges. These are, and I hate to say this, pretty bad all around. But let's start with my favorite one, the Trial of Patience, where you have to count to 12 while not getting distracted. This is easier said than done, my favorite distraction being Emily talking about very specific numbers right around where we're at in the count. There's one trial where we have to fend off the spider ant things, which is unbelievably easy to the point where it didn't really feel finished, and the agility trial where we run after a bug across the map. It's fine. The worst one by far though is the Trial of Insight. Run around in a bamboo thicket and hope to God you don't get stuck. This is awful, and I'm happy to say that I didn't have to retry this one more than once. It's not only hard to tell where the bug is going, but you keep getting stuck on the wonky geometry. It's frustrating more than anything. Kinda like Dark Souls 2. Finishing this questline, we fight a samurai guy. This is a very anticlimactic fight and feel more like a mini-boss than the official ending to CrossWorlds. A plus is that it's a good fight, but again, it really should have been something more substantial. I know the game itself doesn't end, but the fact that CrossWorlds' final boss is so boring and generic feels very out of place. A couple of these attacks are very fun to dodge, especially the fast zips and larger sweeps, and its health pool feels appropriate. Again, it's a really good fight. Defeating the boss, we've finally reached the end game of CrossWorlds, the game within the game, and the final act of CrossCode, the game we, the player, are playing. Continuing into the next area, we're faced with a dungeon, but it's unfinished, to be released as an expansion later. We've also officially opened the door to Rhombus Square, the futuristic city we saw in the beginning of the game. This place is massive, which to me doesn't make much sense. There's a couple of shops here, but mostly just a lot of space. It looks great and all, but it feels empty. There's only a single quest to be found here, the last edition of the Broken Weapons questline, that proceeds to take us back to Sapphire Ridge instead. This is a bit of a letdown. A lot of the conversations in the game have alluded to this place, and unlike Baldur's Gate 3, where about a fourth of the game could take place here, it instead acts as one big gallery to run through right before we go finish the main quest. At most, it's the place where we go and buy our last set of equipment. There's also an arena here if you want to go grind out some high scores. If you know me though, I don't really care for this type of stuff. I just want to see the good side quests and find all the worthwhile sites. This arena isn't that. It's fine for the people yearning for more combat, but it isn't much more than that. There are also some special arena weapons you can earn, but equipment is rarely worthwhile to me. There's plenty of it to be bought just a couple of rooms away. Entering a cave in Sapphire Ridge, we're reminded of one of the dreams we had early on. The one where we ran around in a cave for no reason. This is the key to entering this secret area. We need to run through these cave sections in specific ways, and a teleporter spawns. This section is a bit annoying, but it doesn't drag on for that long, so it's okay. We're teleported to the area from the intro of the game, but don't make it far before meeting Shizuka. She isn't very happy about it, but Leah has grown as a person, diverged from Shizuka so much the things she says really don't faze us anymore. We know what Leah is, and she has accepted her fate. Shizuka fights us in PvP. We get stomped, frankly, but there's nothing she can do anymore to actually hurt us. The PvP abruptly ends and we're taken to meet Satoshi. We're then barraged with a huge info dump. Breaking it down to the most important parts, we're left with this. Leah is the first functional Evotar, created by the three missing developers Satoshi, Shizuka, and Gotham for Mr. Sidwell within the playground itself. Gotham is also there, but in person, physically for some reason. The obvious next step was what they would use these Evotars for. As it turns out, Sidwell were going to use them to extract information from their originals, because every Evotar is a copy with the same set of memories. It's kind of like Inception without the dreams. The Satoshi standing in front of us is also a copy. The real one died of an unnamed condition 2 years ago, in that cutscene we saw in the beginning. Last but certainly not least is the fact that Leah is the only one that can save all of these people. She is the only one that can enter the Evotar server without the data being deleted. We also finally find out that the weird blue and orange avatar is in fact Gotham. We leave the rest of the technical stuff of how we're going to storm and save the Evotars in the Vermilion Wasteland to Sergei and Satoshi, and have a sit down with Shizuka. This is a great scene. The dialogue here just reiterates that these two are completely different. They have some things in common. They both hated the horns on their head and loved a badass scar on their face. Shizuka is jealous. Leah was always looked after and cared for, while she felt left out. The last drop for Shizuka is when Leah tries to touch her. Leah is nothing like Shizuka. She's a totally different person. I have mixed feelings of this lore dump section. First of all, it's a lore dump. That's not very fun. I also really don't like all the weird turns the game has to take in order to make Satoshi the good guy here. He's the one that made the AIs in the first place, but now he's the good guy? There's a moral question here that I can't really answer. Is it moral to create a sentient machine? I think so. Is it moral to create a sentient being for a specific use? Well, that's a very different question, and we don't really know what he wanted to use them for. I get that he was sort of blinded by his creation. He got to play God and create something outside of Instatainment's somewhat confining walls, but he must have known that the things just don't add up here. It's a bit of a hole to me, and I have some difficulties looking past it, to be completely honest. Going back to the Vermilion Wasteland acts as this game's last chapter, and the "there's no turning back" point. Before this, there are a lot of things you can do. The game is very 100%able in that way. Every chest, every type of plant, and side quests. There are plenty of things to help you along too. There's a chest finder and lots of gauges and stuff to be found in the menus. I've never been a completionist in any way, so there's a lot of minor stuff here that I missed. There are also probably some major stuff. Maybe I missed your favorite side quest. Sorry about that. When we log out, we get some backstory on Sidwell. It feels super rushed and comes way too late, and it tries to make the villain more likable. Scenes from when Sidwell tried to teach Leah stuff in the wasteland. I straight up don't like this, and if it showed up earlier it might have worked, but here it really doesn't. We've seen him at his worst, torturing people, and these memories don't add to that except maybe making him look even more emotionally manipulative. We get the whole gang together to explain the game plan and finally sort of come out to our friends that we are in fact an AI. Sergey explains everything. Everything from the fact that there's a copy of Lucas in the wasteland to our epic escape. We need help to storm the wasteland, and of course they're in. The raid starts off like everyone is going to die. While we're running through the secret road to the Vermilion Wasteland, we can stop and talk to all of Leah's friends. A couple of standouts include the talk we have with the gentle giant that is Apollo's friend. It's always so refreshing to hear this guy talk, contrasted against his grass-headed friend. You really must have gone through a lot. Yet, here you are, still happily saying hi to everyone. This just hits so hard. Emily tells Leah she's sorry and reminds us that Tronny isn't here. He's actually been strangely absent for a while now, which is a big part of the DLC. Our first goal in the wasteland is to collect as many avatars as possible and all give them a status effect at the same time to crash the avatar server. Sidwell gives us a very warm greeting, and the Wasteland Heist is officially underway. This gameplay segment works very well. It feels appropriately epic while not making it hard or too easy. It does kind of get annoying to go get some of the avatars, especially one specific one that leads you around the entire area, but other than that, it's a lot of fun. You get to use all of your abilities and you'll level up quite a bit here. But I didn't. Turns out I had equipped an item that gave me some amazing defenses, but also an XP nullifier. Not a multiplier, but a nullifier. Most armor have stuff like this, the XP nullifier being maybe the most severe one. Oops. With Shizuka's help, we get to the final couple of avatars. But Sidwell has no intention of letting us through the door. He's in control of the instances and we can do absolutely nothing. He gives us a little villain speech about how this was all for the money and that's what it always was about. Somehow, like we're the protagonist in a game or something, the blue avatar, Gautham, shows up to give us his ultimate experience one final time. One last dungeon before he can let us go. He also has access to the tower and he lets us in. To him, this is all a game, like it's always been. And you not getting a cool dungeon after all of this wouldn't be very fun, would it not? The Vermilion Tower adds a couple of new enemies and a new puzzle mechanic. The mechanic, like every other so far, is deceptively simple and gets reused in the boss fights throughout the dungeon. This one has 5 instead of the usual 1 mid-dungeon boss, but they're pretty simple. The puzzles themselves are great for the most part. I have to admit that the new mechanic doesn't really make the whole thing all that much better. A few of them use it in a couple of clever ways, but most of the puzzles use it like a normal switch. These puzzles, because it's the end of the game, also get very intricate, using all the elements and puzzle pieces we've learned so far. Another highlight is the very last one. Climbing the tower to meet this room-spanning Rube Goldberg machine is outright overwhelming the first time we see it. But and I'm starting to annoy myself a bit here, it's not actually that complicated. It's a bit fast and there's a lot to do in this puzzle, but it's really just a big showcase of all the mechanics combined, and it's followed by a boss fight that does the same thing. The final boss of the entire game, sorry, spoilers, is against Gotham's avatar, the ultimate challenge. First, we fight his avatar. The fight is a rehash of the fight against him before we get sent to the Vermilion Wasteland, and unlike that time, we actually beat him. 1v1s like these are always fun in CrossCode, and this one works exceptionally well. The biggest issue here is the fact that the arena has an endless pit around it. Some of my punishes were cut short because I accidentally pushed him off and had to shoot him instead. This is a problem in some of the other fights, but in this one it felt a bit extra annoying. This is already a long fight, so prolonging it like this feels unnecessary. Getting him down to half health, we ascend into the literal heavens. This arena is outright epic, above the clouds, white pillars in the background. It feels like we're fighting God, something like a lot of JRPGs like to do, and the avatar is now a blue and golden elephant, kind of like the Hindu god Ganesha. The fight is officially on for real. This one is a lot like the other bigger fights. Hit the weak points with a specific element after dodging some attacks. This is fun, but some of the elements are definitely harder than others. The ice phase is extremely scary because of its huge damage, while most others feel too easy in comparison. After breaking the boss, we're faced with a short puzzle. These are only there to make us use all the elements, but it feels like a nice send-off for them. The fight took me just under 30 minutes, and that's just one continuous run. That's actually crazy, in the best way possible. I know I had some reservations about the previous huge fight, but here it makes sense to me. This is really the ultimate challenge, and the last CrossCode boss we get to fight. It has basically everything we've encountered so far. Not all at once, but all after another, merging in and out and combining with each other in new ways. It's a fantastic final boss to this 30-hour experience. It's not perfect, but it does get really close. Gotham walks out from his setup and onto the fragile instant matter to congratulate us. We have access to the server. We won and he rewards us. Gotham has finally realized that he has been outmatched by his ultimate challenger. His final level has been cleared, and his purpose here has been fulfilled. His time is over, and he jumps. This comes as a bit of a shock to us. We don't know Gotham outside of that he's a game developer that loves creating interesting gameplay, but also that he took everything a bit too far. This suicide, and I hate to say this, doesn't hit very hard for us. It, like some of the other plot points, feels underdeveloped. I liked Gotham as a character, but I do think that this ending for him doesn't really make much sense. I don't dislike the way he goes, but the way it's handled doesn't make it a very impactful moment for me. And the moment is just almost instantly over, and we don't hang on it almost at all. We've reached the Evotar server. Sidwell is there. He's surprisingly calm. It's kind of chilling actually. All this is to him is an annoyance. It's all just business. This will hurt his giant wallet, but it's nothing he can't take. Sidwell is just surprised he got to do it for so long, and that's about it. He only stayed here to see how it all will pan out. Sergey is understandably furious, but Sidwell just leaves. And that's it. Heist successful. All that's left to do now is to gather all the Evotars and convince Instatainment that they deserve to have a place in the playground. Nothing left to do but log out and hope that Sergey is able to figure it out. CrossCode has two endings, one good and one bad. The major divergence is a single moment, meeting an investor in the game that also happens to be very interested in the Evotars and artificial intelligence as a whole. This ending is very easy to get, and you can do it within a couple of minutes of dialogue. I like the premise of the divergence: go talk to one of the board members, take a Turing test and prove your personhood, but it feels too sudden. This should have been drawn out more and made into a bigger deal. It's fine though, as it's only a way to make it to the DLC, and having to go back multiple hours just to be able to access it because you played the game differently to what the canon wanted would have sucked. The bad ending simply has us not coming back after freeing the Evotars. It was all for almost naught. We stopped Sidwell, but at a huge price. I like this ending, but we'll speak on that more in a couple of minutes. Now, let's finally conclude this video. So where does CrossCode stand to me overall? The gameplay on display here is immaculate from top to toe. There are some stretch marks and a bruise here and there, but that's expected of a game as big as this one. The quick dodge dash move feels great. The melee combat is really fun, and the ranged stuff is definitely well made. I have some reservations about the aiming sometimes, and the shield feels underutilized. Kind of like how Doom Eternal forces some options on you, I wish CrossCode forced me to block a bit more, because when I actually had to, it was a lot of fun. Another bit of gameplay to master. I've already spoken about the very basics a lot, so let's get into some of the ups and downs as a whole. The peak gameplay-wise overall to me is Gaia's Garden. Starting off, the open world here is really fun to explore. It might not be the best one, but it's certainly top 3, alongside Autumn's Rise and maybe Sapphire Ridge. Gaia's Garden also has the best dungeon. Some people seem to love the first two, that being the fire and ice ones. But to me, the peak of dungeoneering goes to the Grand Cruscaggio. First of all, I think that the electricity balls and wave teleport balls are extremely fun to use, and together they make something immensely satisfying. To me, this is the best dungeon in the game, surpassing the last one that uses all the mechanics at once. This dungeon instead goes deeper, which to me is a lot more enjoyable than the admittedly wider Vermilion Tower. In terms of combat, I think the final boss of the game is excellent. To me, it's the best boss in the game, even with its almost 30-minute runtime. CrossCode as a plot is sometimes a bit hard to follow, I have to admit that. It's also very slow at the beginning, and way too fast at the midpoint. It doesn't scream of a great story, but it goes places that really did spark some interesting conversations. First of all, some praise. Leah is one of my favorite gaming protagonists. That says a lot about a completely mute character in a pixel art game. She's so expressive without being annoying, she's realistic without being boring, and she's sassy and fun. Again, this says so much about the quality here, because she doesn't say anything outside of her pre-programmed words. And before we continue with more praise, let's talk about some of my nitpicks with the plot here. There are some holes here that I can't really fill. One of my nitpicks is the fact that Sergei can seemingly pause the game. This is explained later, but still. There are a couple of times where he sends us these long messages that Leah can understand in an instant because she's an AI. But what doesn't make sense here is that Sergei can use them in a way that doesn't make sense. They try to explain it by making them pre-recorded messages, but that doesn't make sense all the time. There are other smaller holes like this throughout. Why can't we see a single other person running around farming early game enemies or parkouring around rooftops also looking for secret items? Stuff like that would make the experience so much more immersive. The dream would be Dark Souls-like multiplayer, but that's asking way too much. More fake players and more gamifying should have been here. It doesn't feel like an MMO most of the time, it just feels like a single player game. Which it is, but moments like the raid or guild stuff tells us a completely different story. My favorite part of the plot is the way it talks about the privilege of being born. I'm not going to try and answer the huge question of sentience all by my own here in this video about the video game, but CrossCode does it in such a mature way I had to try, if only for a minute. Leah's sentience is obvious to us. She's a person like any other we've met so far, and she's played by us, a human, putting our emotional weight into her. She's nothing like the stereotypical NPC, or anything close to the NPCs we see in the game itself. Leah forms bonds with others, she expresses frustrations at her limitations, and evolves as she faces trials. While her origins are digital, her responses are definitely deeply human. If she can experience pain, joy, and personal growth, isn't that enough? Leah's journey through CrossWorlds becomes a sort of allegory for the struggle of sentient AIs to assert their existence in a world that may never fully accept them. Just because she didn't have the privilege of being born doesn't make her any less of a person. The jabs at her entire existence hit very hard here. Emily opening up to us about having real-life responsibilities when first entering Maroon Valley, for example. This reminds us, and Leah, that this is a game, and that to most people, there are plenty of things more important outside of it. Trivial things like homework overtake Leah's entire existence in the game, her only existence. When the Grasshead challenges us to yet another duel, he stubbornly refuses to call Leah by her name. This isn't just an annoyance for her, it cuts much deeper. Leah values the little things she can control, the small pieces of her identity that help her feel whole in a world where she can't log off. This refusal to say her name isn't just kind of rude, it's a denial of her humanity, a refusal to see her as a person rather than just a rival or an opponent. She's a nameless spheromancer in a game that Apollo probably forgets the second his mom shouts that the dino nuggets are ready. For Leah, her name isn't just a label, it's a symbol of her entire existence, a thread tying her to the idea of being someone, even in a virtual world. There's also a very powerful, but sadly a bit underdeveloped message about non-conforming people underscoring the entire game. The obvious fact that she's mute, and therefore often misunderstood. Her journey is not just about learning how to speak, it's about proving that her voice matters, even if it's expressed in unconventional ways. This aligns with the lived experience of disabled people who must constantly advocate for their right to even exist, thrive, and be understood on their own terms. Seeing Emily scream at Leah just because she can't keep up in conversation because of her limitations really breaks her heart. She wants to, desperately express herself, but she just can't. That's why it hits so hard. The payoff of them making up later on, the two of them missing each other after the raid gone away, is one of the game's best moments for this reason. And that's what makes Leah remarkable. Her muteness forces her to rely on alternative ways to communicate and express herself. As it turns out, she's a bit of a hug person, for example. This far from diminishes her. Instead, it makes her relatable to anyone who has ever struggled to be understood, whether that be because of language barriers or personal insecurities and so on. Leah's inability to speak really echoes the universal human experience of feeling voiceless in moments of vulnerability, and her perseverance through this limitation teaches us the resilience that defines the human spirit. Leah is not perfect, far from it, but perfection is not what makes someone a person. Her moments of frustration, her struggles to connect with others, and her silent determination, that is what makes her feel real. By the end though, I can't say that I really think the game does the premise justice. It has some great character moments and characters overall, I mean Leah is really good, but the story doesn't manage to stick the landing quite as well. The main game does pretty well, but the good ending just didn't feel very realistic or meaningful. Sure, Leah lives forever within the game, and so do all the other avatars. That's why I prefer the bad ending here actually. She is determined to be just a programmed, not sophisticated enough to pass the Turing test, and wiped from existence. She is murdered and probably forgotten by everyone who wasn't close enough to her to know she was really an actual person. This is a very dark ending that lets us feel sad for an artificial person, an AI, which is a very powerful message I think. The good ending isn't bad, but it's just kind of boring. Everyone except Gotham and the others who were affected along the way live happily ever after. The ending is needed for the DLC epilogue to exist, but it isn't very memorable in itself. Mechanically, it is though. I mean, the ending stretch of gameplay is simply top tier. A half-hour boss fight preceded by the biggest puzzle in the game that uses basically every puzzle piece the game has introduced to us so far. So, overall, CrossCode as a game is fantastic. Everything it tries to do, it does extremely well, especially as an indie with a huge 50-hour campaign scope. At the same time, it's not a once-in-a-lifetime experience like I would call all my other favorites out there. Think games like Dark Souls and The Last of Us, games that will ultimately outlive all of us. But it's a game that feels made for me. I enjoy the gameplay here so much, I could talk about it for about as long as this video's runtime. More than just a great game, CrossCode is a pure expression of what makes this medium special. Its puzzles, combat, and exploration aren't just exceptional on their own, and they seamlessly intertwine with the story, world, and characters in a way that simply wouldn't work in any other format. It's a true game, through and through. I love CrossCode and I think it deserves much more. I think it's one of the most hidden of hidden gems of all time, even with its many players. But most important of all, I think it's worth your time and money. Thanks for watching. This video has been in the polls at least once before because I really wanted to talk about this game. It deserves so much more. In the list of favorites I've reviewed, Minecraft is still in first place, followed by Dark Souls. This is where it gets hard though. But I kind of have to put CrossCode over Doom Eternal because of just how much shit there is in this game. I also just like the game more overall, despite the hyper-polished fun in Doom Eternal. This is followed by The Last of Us, Call of Duty Black Ops 2, Doom 2016 and Grand Theft Auto 4. Apex Legends is still in last place, but maybe not for long. Thanks for the Patreon subs for paying for my food this month. As you all know, I lost my job just before Christmas. You guys are really helping me out with your subscription, and I just want to make that clear. The next big video after this one is Dark Souls 2. Yippee! But if you want to decide the one after that, maybe go pay me $1 or $2 and help me out at the same time. I'm still in the middle of trying to make it here on YouTube, so just liking and commenting and stuff really helps too. Again, thanks for watching.